All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Melissa Zuro, and I am the marketing director at Warescape, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar about streamlining your cloud journey. We're going to dive into how to simplify the complex process around migrating warehouses to the cloud by using migration. Our industry expert, Mike Ferguson, is going to go into the key migration stages, the planning steps, best practices, so you can accelerate your cloud journey. First, I'd like to introduce Mike. He is the CEO of Intelligent Business Strategies, over 40 years of IT experience, specializing in business intelligence, analytics, data management, big data, and enterprise architecture. Super excited to have him with us today. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping items. Bottom of the screen, you'll see a QA icon. Feel free to enter in any questions and we'll get to them at the end of the session. With that being said, let's get started. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. Many thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. So I want to talk about data warehouse migration, which can be quite complex. These systems been around in many cases for a lot of years, could be 10, 15, sometimes even 20 years, where lots happened to those systems over time, a lot of changes, a lot of add-ons and whatnot. So migrating that, to the cloud is, it can be quite daunting, quite challenging and overwhelming for a lot of organizations. And so, I want to look at how we can sort of systematically do this and simplify it and speed it up as we go ahead. As Melissa kindly said, a little bit about me, over 40 years or so in the industry now. I started out as a regular database administrator. And then early in my career, I co-founded a company with Dr. Cod on the left-hand side here, who is a Turing Award winner, and Chris Tate on the right-hand side, who wrote lots of books on databases. So um, anyway, and then I went off to Teradata and before setting up my own company over 30 years ago now. So I'm also chairman of Big Data London, which is the largest data analytics conference in Europe, over 20,000 delegates. And if you ever get a chance, if you're based in Europe, well, hopefully you get to the show. If not, if you're in the US, we get a lot of folks from the States coming over to London for that. So if you can get there next year, it'd be great. Anyways, um, I want to look at, you what's the drivers behind this? What are the stages associated with data warehouse migration? How you go about planning this and what should be in the kind of preparation, you know, the migration, which is clearly a very important step, and then look at the actual, different options that you have as a migration strategy and what exactly has to be migrated and how you can systematically go about that, and then what the implications are if you want to make changes to your data warehouse during migration, which of course could mean several things. Could mean that you might want to change the design, for example. The data model is often frequently changed in this kind of project, or it might even be that you want to change underlying technologies, underlying database technologies, for example. So we look at that and also how you can de-risk the project in order to, let's say, reduce the possibilities of things going wrong during a migration, and also accelerating the speed at which you can do it, particularly using data warehouse automation as a way to help you with that. So, you know, clearly what I see is a number of business factors and a number of technical reasons why people are migrating data warehouses to the cloud. On the business side, obviously there's a shift away from capital expenditure, which is what you would use to buy, hardware and whatnot, for on-premises systems, towards operational expenditure on a kind of pay-as-you-go model on the cloud. And so that makes a sort of significant difference from that perspective, obviously, particularly around initial funding. And so CFOs have often looked upon that as quite a favorable thing. Um, in addition, many systems that you may have on premises over the years, you've added on more and more to your data warehouses, and with more and more data sources uh, cropping up, people want to do more on there, and you might be kind of getting close to kind of capacity, and you kind of think, well, adding more data sources is just going to mean you're going to have to go for a massive hardware upgrade, which could cost you a lot of money, or you could look to have sort of scalability option on the cloud as an alternative. Obviously storage is fairly cheap over there too, and with more and more data volumes happening, that can be a driver, or it may even be that the technology you're running on is kind of end of life or thereabouts, and so migrating to a different technology makes sense for that reason. So there's several reasons here to want to do this, maybe to take also advantage of other technologies running in the cloud. On the technical side, well, clearly, with growing data volumes, you need kind of I guess elastic staging areas and stuff like that to be able to handle this and allow it to grow. Um, and scalability, really matters to be able to both separate storage from compute and scale both independently of each other, and then shut down compute when you don't need it. Um, that's another driver here. Um, you may already have several data sources in the cloud or in other off-premises data centers, such as software as a service, transaction processing applications, where your data is coming from for your data warehouse. And so therefore, kind of moving to a cloud environment may simplify that. And you want to exploit other services which are perhaps already being used in other parts of your business on the cloud, such as machine learning. Data science may create machine learning models that you want to deploy in your data warehouse, and use them in a cloud environment. And even if you've got other analytical data stores that you may want to join to your data warehouse in a kind of logical data warehouse architecture, or exploit real-time or near real-time data warehousing through streaming into a cloud data warehouse. All those are driver behind it. Now, I just picked one survey off the internet, this one here from Flexero this year, showing that already, data warehouse on the cloud is a big deal, at the top of the chart here. But also, the growth in machine learning and AI, which no doubt will exploit data in the data warehouse and even potentially run using data in the data warehouse, has already become the most important area that companies are experimenting with to, if they're not already in production in that space. So there's a lot of priority going into the whole world of data warehousing and data and AI in general and analytics. And pretty well every major data warehouse database that's being used is already on the cloud. Some of them born on the cloud. Some of them, you know, you've had on premises for a lot of years, but they also have a cloud option. So therefore, you could potentially move to them. So there's no shortage, if you like, of technologies already over there. So what exactly are the stages involved in this? Well, naturally, there's kind of three stages. There's pre-migration planning, there's the actual migration itself, and then there's sort of post-migration activity. And if I was to pick one of these, then very clearly, number one, the first one would be the most strategic, most important, because the more work you put into that, the more meticulous you are there. Likelihood is that you're going to be relatively pain free during your migration, and so you can there's no surprises that would emerge from that. So there's a whole bunch of things to look at in pre-migration planning, including why are you doing it, including what's the scope of this migration, what about your skills and training and everybody, getting everybody up to speed there, any changes that you want to make and what the implications of those are, and looking at the overall order of migration. Then you've got to get down to the migration itself and start systematically looking at each of the areas that you've got to migrate. After after the migration, all of the kind of parallel running and whatnot. But clearly, key questions you want to answer in the planning phase are obvious things like, is, everybody trained, have skills on both? That is both on-prem where they're perhaps very fluent, but also in the cloud as well. And if you're changing underlying database, then you may have to get new skills on that new database technology if you haven't been using it before. How are you going to just, prevent your existing users who are using reports and machine learning and whatnot on your data warehouse? How are you planning to shield them from any disruption as you go about this? And are you planning to add some kind of more agility in here? What does that mean? Does that mean like changes in your, data model design? Are you going to switch from, I don't know, your existing design, which could be Kimball-like, the data vault, or are you going to, make, significant changes to parts of your data warehouse in some way in terms of data model? Are you going to change the technology, like switching to a different database management system? Which parts of this look like they could migrate with minimal effort, and which ones are needing a complete overhaul and therefore more complicated to kind of move. All of these kind of things are need to be looked at, and so you need to be fluent in both environments, as I already said, so you can work and switch easily between the two. I think as well, having a test environment in the cloud, if you want to try things out before you actually try them out for real, so to speak, is a great idea. So there's no surprises, when you actually come to do it. But then you've got to really, let's say, sit down and take your existing data warehouse apart. Lay it out there. Just lay everything out, everything about it, all your data models of all of your data warehouse and existing data marts, your staging tables, um, any ETL or ELT data flows that you have, whether that's from data sources to data warehouse to marts, whether it's within the data warehouse in a kind of ELT fashion, any dependencies that are there, like if you've got any store procedures that are being invoked, any of those kinds of things. Reports that are downstream of this and kind of dependent on everything. Your all of your data sources looking at the strangely enough, looking at the data quality. I have seen poor quality data making it into data warehouses. And sensitive data, of course, now that we live in a world of privacy compliance, we have to make sure we understand about all of that and any data redundancy that may be in there, um, and any challenges you already have. And the whole purpose here is to lay it out the way it is, be honest with yourself, understand, where are there difficulties, where are we strong, where are we weak, and then look at your technologies and see what you're going to change, so you really are clear about everything out there. And then out of that assessment, you're either going to come out thinking, yeah, real happy with everything as it currently is, and so it should just migrate it the way it is, or there's some things we don't like, we're going to alter those and then migrate, perhaps, or either migrate and alter, um, or there's just stuff that's just really no point continuing with it. We want to just totally redesign, and it might be, um, out of that assessment, you're going to come to some kind of decision here. But one thing I would say is once you've done the assessment, re-estimate staffing costs and the budgeting of the whole thing, because you'll find stuff in that assessment that you didn't realize that, the implications of, that you would perhaps may have found impact on the resources that you need to handle it. Then you got to define a strategy, and which clearly means then, well, what are we going to do? Are you going to lift and shift it as it is? Are you going to try and simplify the existing data warehouse and migrate it? Or is it, that you really have done your assessment, you think, this is really kind of almost at the end of life and you need to be a kind of redesign and then just migrate your data, but you've got to decide that. And then, if you are making changes to certain things like your data models, like your underlying database technologies, etc., then you're going to increase the risk. Um, and you've got to find ways to mitigate that risk so that it doesn't, let's say, interfere or harm your migration in any way. So what I mean by that is, if you look at lift and shift, let's say, sake of argument, you're running on premises with a Kimball design with Teradata. and then you're going to move to the cloud. So we're just going to lift and shift, run Teradata on the cloud, same design. That's a lift and shift. So, nothing um, untoward about that. Pretty straightforward, right? Whereas, if you have Kimball design on premises, let's say, and then you want to move to the cloud, but now I want to shift to data vault design on the data warehouse whilst leaving the data marts maybe as a Kimball style of design, then that is a big change. It's going to cause major structural change in the data, has big impacts on inbound ETL and outbound ETL, into and out of data warehouses. Um, all of that's going to be impacted by it. But then it's even further impacted if you then choose to change the underlying database as well, say, moving to Snowflake or whatever database you may choose. Doing these kind of things increases the risk, and then the question is, well, where do you do these things? Do you do them before you migrate? Do you do them after you migrate? Or do you attempt to do them during the migration? If you do them during, then clearly, risk is going to go up. Then you've got to look at what you've got to migrate. And clearly, that's a breakdown. We need to know we have to migrate the schema, the data, the ETL processing, any metadata, any users, user groups, roles, privileges that you may have, any of your operations jobs like backups and things like that. And of course, all of your reports and everything, machine learning models and everything that are using it. So I want to look at these one by one just briefly. First of all, is schema. Of course, that could be, looking at your data warehouse production tables, your data mart schemas, your staging tables. And so, the objective obviously is to migrate and get at least the same level of performance, if not better than you currently have. But I mean, certainly if you're going to migrate, then scope matters when it comes to schema, So if you just migrate one data mart at a time, that's pretty easy. It's pretty incremental, just that one data mart. And then maybe, or you could do all of your data marts uh, at once. It's a bit more complex. Or you could say, well, you're going to just move the data warehouse first. Well, that's a even bigger hit because that's going to impact everything downstream. Or you're going to attempt to move the whole thing. Clearly, you have to decide the one that's least disruptive, least risky, the one that can get you moving to the cloud relatively quickly, and that doesn't cause you overwhelming amounts of work to handle it. You also got to kind of look at your schema migration and create an inventory of everything in your data warehouse and data marts, the database objects that you want to migrate, and there's certain things you want to look out for. I mean, obviously data types, if you're going to switch your database, they could change, may not exist in your target data warehousing environment on a cloud. You want to know about performance, so partitioning of big tables like fact tables, because you need to be conscious of that in the cloud. Integrity constraints you need to be aware of because optimizers on databases care about those kinds of things like keys in order to help with performance. You need to worry about indexes. Again, there may be issues where indexes may not be supported or the same kinds of indexes. Stored procedures may not be supported if you're changing the underlying database. You've got to think about your sizes of these things and even database views, because database views have SQL in them, and SQL may be proprietary to one database, and you may not find it supported on the one you're moving to if you change the database. So a whole bunch of things to think about here, but understanding indexes is important because it indicates performance, what you're doing to help performance on your existing environment. And that will matter on a lift and shift, of course, but if you are changing the database, it still matters because at least it's already giving you hints where you need to think about performance even in a migrated environment. So one way to kind of look at this is to understand what you currently have, and most data warehouses have a set of system tables, if you like, that you can query to find out about everything that's in your data warehouse, and you can exploit that to be able to generate create statements for your target data warehousing environment and to find out about all the things that you need to know about on your existing data warehouse to quickly look for things like table type differences and things like indexes and nulls and partitioning and store procedures, those kind of things that need to be understood. Primary keys and foreign keys you may have running in your existing data warehouse, you might find when you move to the cloud not supported, but still want to know about primary keys because database optimizers, want to know about those things for performance reasons. But certainly, yeah, being familiar with those really matters. What about the data? Well, a number of things to think about here, and I'm sort of skimming over this, given I've got a whole 2 day, well, a whole 1 day detailed class on this. But looking at key questions that you want to ask here with regards to data migration. Well, how big are these things? I mean, you know, what's the current size of your production data warehouse, your production data marts, and is the data currently compressed? Because if you take that data out, guess what? It's going to be uncompressed. And then what size is it going to look like if you uncompress it and need to export it to move it, right? How big is that going to be? And have you got the spare capacity on premises to support that temporarily? Do you need to kind of get approval to reserve that amount of space? I mean, if you're talking about multi-terabyte data warehouses and then you uncompress it and this thing blows up even bigger, have you got the spare capacity on-prem to be able to deal with that? Even on a temporary basis, do you need permission for that? Get approval, given that it's a production system. And also how much of this data warehouse is never used, which would open up questions if you want to migrate that or not. Another thing regarding moving the data is how big's what's the network bandwidth like? And once you get this data off of your on-premises environment, is it sufficient to move your data? And how long is that going to take on your current network? And are you going to move it, using something like Direct Connect, or are you going to use immediate files? I'll talk more about that in a second. And then, or do you plan to physically move this data because it's so big, or are you actually going to send it over the network? I mean, how's this going to work? Do you need a private link rather than moving it over the internet? That kind of thing. So here you see what I mean by direct connect versus flat files. Top of the chart is direct connect, where it's almost like an insert select to some extent. You're pulling data from your on-prem data warehouse going to the cloud. The more popular approach by far, at least from my experience, is the bottom one. Where you're using files, where you're pulling data out of your existing data warehouse. Want to compress it maybe again because it will come out uncompressed, and then moving it. And there's various ways to do that, things like secure FTP and things like that. To get that data over there. But if it's really big, then you may have to go for bulk data movement options to kind of and there's various mechanisms you can look at there to do that. Okay, so what about the ETL processing? Well, again, it's back to a kind of classic data warehouse architecture that you see here, where you kind of bring data into staging tables, you do ELT processing to get it into production, then you're accessing production tables. You may have further ETLs down to other data marts. So again, it makes you say, well, if I migrate one mart at a time, then only the ETL going into that data mart is impacted, in terms of migrating it. So that's pretty, you know, manageable. If you then do one data mart, then the next, and the next, and so on. If you do them all at a time, then it's more work to think about. If you move the data warehouse first, then everything's impacted, all the inbound ETLs, the ELT jobs within the data warehouse and outbound. And of course, if you move the lot, then you're taking on much greater workload in a single migration. Also depends on how these are built. Have you written your own code to do this? Have you used SQL, to do the transformations inside the data warehouse as a kind of ELT sort of processing? Have you used storage procedures? Have you got an ETL to do this? Have you got data warehouse automation to do this, like Workscape, for example? So, and it just depends on what you've currently got as to what you might want to do. I mean, if you've written your own code, you're going to probably have to redevelop that, and for sure, data warehouse automation would make that far quicker to do than writing it all again. Um, But you could, I guess, use other data integration software. But data warehouse automation would speed that up a lot. Stored procedures typically are proprietary, so again, you're going to have to redevelop those. And again, having something like data warehouse automation to move that would be a lot easier to do. If you currently got an ETL tool and it runs in the cloud, I guess you could stick with that. But if it's a lot of those jobs are old and maybe difficult to maintain because people have moved on and whatnot, yeah, perhaps switching to data warehouse automation is an option. If you're currently using data warehouse automation, we'll just carry on using it, but change the target, to wherever your new target system is. In terms of security, well, we got to get all of the users over. We got to get all of the roles. We've got to get all the privileges. All of those got to move. And so again, back to your, data warehouse system tables, pull the data from there, but you can run SQL statements on here and create statements to get all this stuff over there for that environment. Again, that's one option if you want to do that. But again, also, as we'll see in a moment, data warehouse uh, automation software can speed it up dramatically. And then, of course, there's your dashboards and reports. And without a doubt, there's for data warehouses that have been around for 10 years or 15 years or even as far as 20 years, there's a ton of stuff sitting on top of this, from all kinds of reports, spreadsheets directly accessing it. Um, could be across multiple different kinds of tools. You may have data science, accessing data in here, processing it with Python code in Jupyter notebooks. You could have operational applications invoking BI tools to get intelligence embedded in the apps. There's all kinds of stuff sitting on top of that data warehouse. And clearly, if you migrate, there's a potential for all of these to be hit in some way. And so the question is, how do you migrate this with minimum impact? You know, um, and of course, it depends. Are you going to, lift and shift, so you just migrate it as is, which would potentially have the least impact, um, as long as you can just point these at the migrated environment. But most organizations always end up changing schemas and things like that during a migration, and so anything that's exposed directly to a physical schema could be impacted by it. Of course, as well, you need all the dependencies, over there to run these successfully. So like all the users, the user groups, the roles, all the privileges, the schema, the data, everything's got to be over there already. So it's kind of like one of the last things to go. But there are things you can do. I mean, the big challenge will be if it's change of underlying database technology, because clearly certain table types that you may have on-prem may not exist in your new environment. Um, you might have data type differences between the two. You might have SQL incompatibilities because you're using proprietary SQL on your on-prem environment. You're changing a database on the other environment. You have to worry about all those. And so you don't know how bad that is. I mean, how much do you use proprietary extensions on premises? Well, one way to find that out is go to the query logs of your on-premises data warehouse, run scripts, and generate explain statements. You don't need to move data to run and explain in a target environment. So this could be before you move the data even, you can do this. So generate explain statements and take all those queries that are being run by your BI tools and whatnot and explain them over here and see if anything gets thrown out as an error, which would probably be proprietary SQL uh, extensions that are a problem. In which case you're going to be able to then gauge, well, how significant a problem is this, in terms of seeing all those differences. And please remember to check views, by the way, because we put SQL statements in views and we use proprietary SQL extensions in there, so you need to check those too. But the good news is you don't have to migrate everything before you run explains, so it does help you. And there's things you can do here to mitigate risk, you could do something like this. You could put data virtualization between the tools and the existing data warehouse. Then when you migrate over here, if you change any schemas Any structural stuff over here, then as long as the tools are still using the same virtual views, you just change the mappings and you're not going to see much impact. Data virtualization is a trick, if you like, or a mechanism that will allow you to shield a lot of BI tools from being impacted by structural change if you choose to go do that. And of course, you could then put common definitions in here as well in the data virtualization layer. And I'll talk in a second about also creating virtual data marts. But the key point of putting common definitions in here is that all BI reports across all tools get the same data names. They'll, if you do the calculation here, they all get the same result. There's no inconsistency. You kind of eradicate inconsistency across the tools. But the big thing you need to do, obviously, is, when you're doing this, you've got to be able to compare results, and you need a sort of automated suite of tests to be able to kind of do this, and because you're going to run them very, very frequently, very, very regularly. And so have a repeatable test suite, really matters, whether it's all kinds of tests, that you're running, performance tests, compatibility tests, um, you know, data quality tests, all these things, to make sure everything's working okay. And you can, there's things that we can do over there. And then at some point you're going to get to a final switchover, where, there's a point where you've been parallel running for a while, and then you kind of just say, okay, at this point in time, we're going to do a cutover. After that point, all incremental loads are going into my new data warehouse, and you've checked everything's already uh, in good shape, and then you're going to verify everything and do that switch over. So what I've talked about so far is kind of like sort of systematically what you need to do, in planning, pre-migration, what your migration strategy might be, what you've got to actually migrate. But then I want to revisit this whole issue about, well, what happens? You want to make changes during migration. And the reason I want to revisit it is because it's so common. Everybody, people who are very familiar with your on-premises data warehouse, they they know what the issues are, and they know what works well and what doesn't. They know there's stuff in there that they really, if they had time, they would absolutely want to do it better in perhaps in a different way, or change the design. They know where there's performance issues. And so, lift and shift is one thing, but if we start to change to a different data modeling technique, or even just adjust existing data modeling in some way, or we change the underlying database, and then we find that, time series tables in a Teradata system don't work in a Snowflake, or there's a whole bunch of SQL extensions in your on-premises data warehouse that just don't exist in the new data warehouse because you're changing the database and they're not there. I mean, there's a whole bunch of these things that will jump out at you. And so changing the design, even staying with an existing data warehouse, increases the risk. But changing the underlying database as well ratchets up that risk even more. And so then you've got to say, well, okay, given that that's potentially going to happen, then how do what ways are possible to de-risk this, to kind of reduce the number of things that could go wrong, in order to, increase the chances of a very painless, successful migration. And there's a number of options, some of which are relevant, some of which may not be, but, clearly first option is identify redundancy, and eliminate it. So, why do you want to migrate stuff that's never used? I mean, I've certainly worked on projects where I can think of one that comes to mind, where we ran some queries, and we found, we realized that, several tables hadn't been used for several years. And you kind of think, well, hold on a second, why exactly do we want to migrate that? And then another big deal was because we know that there's going to be changes to underlying schema structures and whatnot in the physical design, then you know that any tools currently using that could be, all the reports and dashboards and everything dependent on it could immediately be hit. And so you want to be able to shield the users from that or not even know that those changes happened. Um, because if you expose those changes to them and they see them and they're unfamiliar with it or don't expect it, then, there's a real chance that confidence could be impacted by it. Um, and then there's the architecture itself. We always talk about, well, you want to migrate, but why do you have to change the architecture mid-migration? I mean, couldn't you do some of that before you migrate, which might make the migration itself a lot easier to do? Um, that might be a good way of de-risking the project. And then of course, are there tools out there that can automate this migration for us, which would take a huge amount of pain away and allow us to do this in a far more rapid way. And so all of these are potentially in play, and I'll just cover them briefly. I mean, the first one is you've got to run queries on your existing data warehouse to see if there's any redundancy in there, and there's a few examples from different databases that you see here, which are going to throw up, you know, what I would sometimes call cold data, just not used or so infrequently used. I mean, it might not be, you might find never been used for several years, in amongst the myriad of tables that you may have in there. And so then the question is, well, what do you do about that? Are you going to migrate that? You think, well, what's the point of migrating that if it's never used? And then so you'll think, well, perhaps we can archive it in some way, but keep it online somehow that if people ever do want to go and get it, they can, And so you looking at potentially archiving, which could go to a file system, could be a HDFS if you have a Hadoop cluster on-prem still, or could, I suppose, go to cloud storage, if you wanted to do that even on private cloud on premises, you could maybe even do that. But um, and then you could then look to migrate the rest. But what you could also do is, data virtualization could be helpful there because, it still looks to the user that the data is still available, they still can still access it, but it just doesn't happen to be in your warehouse anymore. And then you could use data, warehouse automation, for example, to migrate the rest. Um, and another thing that you could potentially do to um, uh, this is obviously hide the migration from the users. Again, data virtualization here, and you're going to take your data warehouse and a bunch of data marts, you're going to move it to cloud, maybe it's a lakehouse environment. You're going to change the schema. And then if you're going to go do that, then you don't want these tools to be impacted by that change. And so by giving them a kind of virtual views of your existing data warehouse and then changing the mappings after you migrate, users don't even know the schema changed at all because they're not seeing the physical schema, they're seeing the virtual views in a data virtualization environment. Another thing that you can do is you can say, well, rather than having physical data marts that you see here, and I've got an extreme example, which is country specific sales data marts. Um, I could convert them to virtual data marts. That means they're still functionable. They still can look like they're data marts that they're still able to be accessed by BI tools through a data virtualization layer. But what happens is all those physical databases go away. All those ETL jobs go away. What you're left with is far fewer databases to migrate. You still got the same capability. You're still accessing that data and still satisfying your reports. But what it does mean is less to migrate, so it's less risky. You could also archive off the unused stuff that you don't ever use as well. It cuts it down even more, and then you can migrate the rest. And by the way, those virtual data marts still exist in the migrated environment. They're still being accessed like they always have been over here. But you did it before you migrated and simplified the whole move, made it far less risky, far less to migrate, and um, moved over to the cloud. And then, of course, there's data warehouse automation. And of course, um, you know, this is a way to say, look, is there tooling out there that can understand what we currently have, um, and generate, what we need in the new cloud environment, and obviously there's a lot of power in data warehouse automation tools. That these tools have been around, some cases as for as long as 20 years, and grown up, if you like, with data warehousing, and know about all the quirks and stuff that are in there. And they, they can get, integration with business glossaries to get common data names, for your migrated environment. They can cope with different popular data modeling techniques used in data warehousing, whether that happens to be Data Vault or a Kimball Star Schema environment. They generate the ETL or ELT jobs that you need, and so therefore take care of the code side of that. They can potentially, in some cases, generate a semantic layer to kind of enable all of your tools to get consistent data definitions and whatnot. You can you, you can cope with lake houses now where you may want to use open tables, such as Iceberg or Delta Lake, which are popular open tables you see in lakehouse environments, which are all accessible from data warehouses these days, and can cater for a move to open table format, which could open up your tables to multiple analytical engines, which would be really cool. They can automate migration, and in some cases, support near real-time data warehousing by changing your data sources to, popular streaming data sources like Kafka, for example, and even with support for data virtualization, generate virtual marts for you. So when you begin to look at it, the whole benefit of data warehouse automation in a migration is it's going to reduce the cost, it's going to reduce the risk, it's going to reduce the time to be able to do this, and hopefully increase the chances of you, making changes. As I said, supports multiple data modeling techniques anyway, and also, typically, isn't necessarily prone to human error, in the sense that, it's going to do that, and it's also going to generate your documentation and whatnot for you, and hopefully shorten the time to do that whole thing. And so, the idea here about, kind of reverse engineering, if you like, your existing data warehouse, support any changes in data modeling techniques, and then generate for a new environment, accommodate, additional changes made by data warehouse developers and whatnot, through the user interface, and get your business glossary from a data catalog or whatever to be able to handle that is kind of what we want, right? But we want to go beyond just data warehouse migration. Could you put the data, maybe, we could do the migration, but could you go beyond that? Maybe after the migration, you would want to say, well, couldn't we move to data products in open tables and consume them within the data warehouse? And so, well, yeah, you could. I mean, you could use automation to generate pipelines, create data products, and then the data products can be used in a data warehouse. But if I put them in open tables, well, then I can kind of collapse all of these things down and start to see merger between data warehouse and lakehouse coming together, simplify our overall data architecture for an analytical environment, and sort of use the power of metadata, um, to understand our data products and generate pipelines to produce data products in open table format, which can be consumed within the data warehouse. And so what that kind of means is that your data warehouse is still there, but you're able to kind of use automation to create the data products in Lakehouse open tables. And I can access those open tables from my data warehouse. So nothing just like any other proprietary tables. But at the same time, I've now opened up the tables to other analytical engines where other things are running. And so rather than having separate data stores for all of these things, if I want to do data science, I can access the same tables as data warehouse is accessing. If I want to do streaming analytics, well, I can stream data directly into these open tables, using technologies like Flink or whatever, or push the data into Kafka and have data warehouse automation pick the data up from there and give you near time, real data, near real time data warehousing as well. And so the implications are pretty significant. It's not just about migration, but going beyond that, almost to modernize your architecture, could be done potentially more smoothly. So, there's no question if I was to wrap this up now that what we got is a data warehouse migration can be complex. These are systems have been around a long time. A lot of stuff happened over the years. And taking your time to be absolutely thorough with that in your migration planning and get it right, it really matters. Don't rush yourself. Make sure you understand everything. So there's no surprises. And then, don't migrate stuff you don't need to migrate. If it's never used, then why are you migrating it? And then consider ways to, simplify things, simplify your architecture before your migration, shield users from schema changes, and de-risk the migration project in a way that helps you shorten the time to migrate, which is why I think data warehouse automation, will help you do these things. And so potentially, is a powerful sort of tools that can help you successfully move to the cloud. So it's been a short time doing this presentation, but I hope you found that useful. And I'll just like to say thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come along to this. And we'll just see if there's any questions that I can answer between now and wrapping up. Maybe I'll hand back to Melissa at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a few questions that came in. The first one was, what are the common challenges that people or organizations face when they migrate over to the cloud?
I, I think common challenges are well, it depends. If you're going to change the database, common challenges are always going to be incompatibilities between the database you're currently running on and the database you're moving to. And that's going to be in both the DDL, in other words, the types of tables you have, data types may not, we have a SQL standard, but over the years, every vendor's changed or added to, if you like, extended the SQL standard for their own underlying database. And so if you're using any of those, proprietary extensions, which could be different, data types for this database that don't exist on another one, or stored procedure languages, which are not industry standard, and don't just port, or any SQL extensions that are existing in one database and you're changing your database. All of these are they're gonna come out of the woodwork. You should expect them to come out of the woodwork. If you're going to change your underlying database to a different vendor technology during a migration or as part of a migration, then you should expect to see these and you should be looking for them. As part of your preparation is to understand the extent of that so that you can gauge how big a deal this is for your current setup, And so I think those are absolutely common. And I think as well, other common mistakes tend to be that people they don't think about testing enough. You need repeatable test suites. You're going to run those things again and again and again. Getting a test specialist on your team really matters. I think having a test environment, on the cloud. So if you're not sure about something, is this going to work? Can we try it out um, first so that there's no surprises and you know what's going to happen in terms of overall behavior? I think those are the things that really matter to me, I would say.
Thank you so much, Mike. There's another question that just came in. Are there studies or lessons learned that concretely establish the assessments have significantly improved the actual migrations? Point to any resources and specifically around the impact of assessments.
Haven't seen any ebooks on this. I'm sure there probably are, with companies that have, lessons learned kind of deal. I wouldn't say there's universally available things, but if you're not going to do an assessment, I mean, I really think that would be, in my opinion, that would be a red line. I mean, I wouldn't, I wouldn't want to attempt this without an existing assessment. You really need to understand what's in there because people who've worked on your data warehouse over 15 years or 10 years, could have moved on. They're working for other organizations. There's stuff in there that not everybody's going to know about, and so doing the work to understand that is really going to allow you to make much more, let's say, informed judgments about scope, about order migration, all of these things, in a way that makes far more sense than finding out about them mid-migration. I mean, these things start going wrong when you mid-migration that could threaten the whole success of the project. And if the project fails as a result of it, I mean, that's 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 a terrible situation to be in. So, to me, I haven't seen any, let's say, universally wide resources that people uh, always go to, but I would say that there's plenty of ebooks, and I think all kinds of conferences in this area. I've been talking about this for quite a number of years now on experiences around it. So can't really point you to anything right now. I'm sure if we you know dig around, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. But for sure, there's no doubt that companies that have got some companies got multiple warehouses, and what they learn on the first, they try and do better the second time around if they're migrating them.
Thanks so much, Mike. And then another follow-up question came through about what are the automation tools or vendors that you'd recommend for migrations with good success rates?
Well, I mean, obviously, Wordscape's currently sponsoring this webinar. I mean, I've certainly seen their migration um, capability, being used in the past. I would certainly, you know, take a look at those. I mean, there are, uh, if you're doing other things like changing your ETL vendors and everything else, I mean, real question is, it just depends on the combinations of technologies you have and what you want to do. But I certainly see several um, utilities out there that are available to do this. But certainly, Wordscape is definitely one of them.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. One more question came through. What do you recommend as the priorities in order to achieve the most efficient and seamless transition to the cloud?
Well, value obviously matters here, anchoring, if there's a way to scope some of the migration based upon value to your business, in terms of, let's say, strategic outcomes that are supported, decisions that are focused around strategic outcomes of your business. Maybe that's one way of looking at this, and I think. But I also talked about migration approaches, like if you did one data mart at a time, and from what I've experienced, I think working backwards, that is to say, starting with a data mart and and going from that end of it, migrating those back towards your data warehouse, then migrating that is a lot less risky than if you say, let's migrate the warehouse. Because if you take you want to migrate the warehouse, in a one-off migration, that, you know, if that's your first um, if that's the order in which you're going to do it, that every single data mart is immediately impacted, which means you're almost by default forced to migrate everything. And so there's far more to worry about in your project, and less opportunities to do a phased migration than if you go kind of data mart at a time. But rather than just looking at a data mart at a time, you might find that some of the data marts you're using absolutely linked to strategic business priorities. Maybe it's, I don't know, say for example, let's say you're a bank and fraud is very high priority for you. Maybe you've got a data mart or a couple of data marts that are associated with fraud. That's super high priority. Maybe there's additional things you want to do in your new data warehousing environment, that are around fraud that maybe you can't do on your existing. And so, clearly there's a value, uh, driven decision there that could influence this. So clearly, you might then say, well, look, we're going to prioritize these marts before these ones because, there's a high value initiative here. It's high priority for the organization, and that will that will influence it. But I mean, it shouldn't just be necessarily linked to entirely technical decisions. I think there are other factors influencing this, and obviously resources and cost and time, you know, are all factors. And if you can, shorten the time and accelerate the whole process, and de-risk at the same time, it's going to make a difference.
Fantastic. There aren't any more questions right now, but if anyone has any, feel free to pop them into the chat or the QA below. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I really want to thank Mike for your insights, your expertise. It's been a fantastic presentation, and of course, everyone for attending. Thank you for taking time out of your day. Hope we found it valuable, informative, and if you have any questions, please reach out to us. Either Mike, his info is on the screen, or just marketing@wearscape.com. We'll send out the recording and the slides to you tomorrow. Otherwise, make sure you keep your lookout for other webinars from us. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thanks everybody.